So I'm staying at the moment with Jim and Zibby Tozer, and came out Wednesday morning, as many of you did, to this white Christmas early. And I said to myself, Ogle, you're not in San Diego anymore. And to greet me as I was trying to get my car down the driveway, the Tozers have this little barn, and there was a little miniature pony and a little black sheep and a little white sheep, and it looked straight out of central casting for Christmas. And all we needed was the children's pageant and for Jesus to arrive. So right on that, just before Thanksgiving, we were all slowed down, and the animals were preparing for Jesus. And kind of it's what the season of Advent is really about. How do we slow down, and how do we make our lives ready for Jesus coming among us? And there's a wonderful phrase when the priest in the Orthodox Church consecrates the holy bread. He lifts it up and he says, "Behold, all things are now ready. Now is the time for God to act." And that's kind of what Advent is preparing us for. It is the season of contemplation, seeing where God is active in each other and in our world, and surprising ways that we may wake up to that. And often, as I discovered on Wednesday, in the ordinary. And as I made my way to church, the roads on Wednesday were horrible. But I saw the snow plows as angels. And I happened to get a couple driving in front of me, which was a blessing, preparing the way of God's people to church. So it's a way of seeing things differently, and how we slow down enough that we can see God in each other. And we open the season with these very powerful words from Isaiah. And he lived 8th century BC. The book is probably written over 3 generations, but it is incredibly packed with wisdom. The sages speak to us, and it's set in a time of horrible conflict, bitter local squabbles, military incursions, and a kind of loss of identity. Who are we? Where are we going? What have we done wrong that all these bad things are happening to us? And the opening of today's reading, is basically, okay, God, why don't you just come down and fix this mess? And there's a kind of rant that goes on, and then it ends with these wonderful words that we are your people. We are the pot that you have made, and your fingerprints are on this inadequate creation. And I love, in Isaiah and in these wonderful readings during Advent, there's a sense that we're allowed to argue with God. We're allowed to fight with God. One of my favorite Psalms is Psalm 139, and I love the first chunk of it, but I don't like the piece that says, "Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God, that thirst for blood. Depart from me. Do I not hate those, O Lord, who hate you? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with a perfect hatred." And the Psalms and Isaiah are kind of like that. It's not just about we turn up in our Sunday best. It's kind of all of us. The parts that we're not particularly proud of. So we go in scriptures from these heights of poetic majesty into the depths when we're having bad hair days. And all of that's okay. All of that is perfectly fine. I was thinking about kind of my own life. A very immature Albert Ogle Jr. once had a conversation with my creator, Albert Ogle Sr., and I was having a rant, as many children do with their parents. And I was saying basically, if you had been a better parent, and I had a more loving upbringing, I would have saved thousands of dollars in therapy. And his response was simply, and he was a very simple guy, but he just said, "But you turned out okay, didn't you?" You can't argue with that. And Isaiah is basically saying the same thing this morning. He has a rant, and then he says, but God, this is how you made us. And how do we figure this out? And that those of us who have played with clay know that the creation of a pot is a two-way street. You are influenced by how the clay is also shaping, and then you leave your fingerprints in that creation. So Isaiah is really, really important, and I would say it's probably one of the most important books, holy books, that has not only defined Judaism, but it's really defined Christianity. And we don't understand who we are as a people without kind of delving into the words of Isaiah the prophet. And it's very interesting that some of you have been to Nazareth, the place where Jesus grew up as a boy. And there is a very holy place, which is the synagogue in Nazareth. And it is smaller than this nave. It's tiny. It's a little corbelled stone roof. And it's a very sacred place. And it may not be the actual physical building where Jesus preached his first sermon on Isaiah 61. But certainly in terms of how the streets would have been laid out in the first century, it is a very holy place, and it's just so simple. And it is in that very simple context that Jesus unrolls the Isaiah scroll, and he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives and freedom to prisoners, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn." And I often think of Jesus either kind of in Sunday school or doing Bible study. And Isaiah was this gold mine of material for him to understand who he was. And it's interesting, we know that everybody, probably, his parents and his Sunday school teachers, they were all very proud of little Jesus, and now he was preaching the sermon, but they didn't like what he had to say, and they ran him out of town. I often think if he went through the Episcopal Church's ordination process, he wouldn't get through the first step, because his own congregation didn't support him. And it was a premonition of how his interpretation of this identity was going to be taken. And it's interesting also think that one of the things the church did in the first century after the resurrection, and they were trying to figure out who this Jesus and this Messiah was, they would go through scriptures and try and figure out what were the key texts and what were the prophecies that were associated with this new image of what it meant to be the Messiah. And Isaiah was the gold mine of how they saw Jesus. And I'll give you some of the texts that were all from Isaiah. The branch of the Lord, the virgin son, the wonderful counselor, the stem of Jesse, the stone in Zion. The good shepherd comes from Isaiah. The servant of the Lord, the suffering servant, obviously, the light to the Gentiles, and the one who brings good news. And you can understand that within the context of interpretation of Scripture, and particularly worship, that the early church started connecting the life of the physical Jesus with the life of the risen Christ. And it only makes sense if you see it through the lens of books like Isaiah. And especially, the key issue, and it's still a kind of major conflict in religions today, many of the religions, about the nature of the Messiah. Who is going to come? And In Jesus' time, it was the warrior Messiah who would come on the white horse and defeat the Romans and free people from slavery. That was what everybody believed, but that's not what he saw in Isaiah. He saw the suffering servant. He saw that the Messiah was to suffer and to transform the world in a different way. And it's interesting in the gospel reading today, he uses the Son of Man coming in his clouds of glory. And what are the angels doing? They're not beating up on people. They are gathering. They are gathering people from all the ends of the earth and heaven. So his interpretation of the work of the Messiah and the people of God was very different from the people that he grew up among. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is this whole idea of the apocalypse, because Jesus obviously believes that in his lifetime there will be some kind of cataclysmic change. And even the stories of the crucifixion and the resurrection, it is absolutely implicit that somehow this death, this suffering would bring about a cataclysmic change in the cosmic order. And Jesus wasn't right about that. It didn't happen in his lifetime. It didn't happen at his death. Paul was also wrong about it. Early letters, they talk about you don't have to get married because the world's going to end anyway. No point in having babies. And Paul changes his mind. And the wisdom of the church is really not to dwell on this. I know it's kind of very popular in certain American circles to... actually, tomorrow there's a great conference in Dallas. If you want to be scared out of your wits about the end of the world, several thousand people will gather in Dallas, and you'll have a great time preparing for the end of the world. But the wisdom of the church is not to dwell on this. We don't know. But to live each day as if it were a lifetime, and as if it was the last day. That's the wisdom of the church. So how do we... let me finish the thought about, Jesus, if he was fully human and fully God, of course he would believe the apocalyptic messages of his day. He's not a kind of, time traveler who knows about... He's not a kind of, Steve Jobs who knows everything. Because if he's fully human, he's in that moment. And of course he would believe this. So I think that his apocalyptic interpretation is just absolutely perfect because he's a man of his age. But we are now in the new dispensation. And Advent invites us to think differently about this new revelation, just as Jesus uncovered this new revelation in these ancient texts. And Advent invites us to do that. And I love the kind of physical, tangible season. Advent is such a wonderful... Nancy did a beautiful Advent series about the music of Advent just before this service. And we're going to take a little more time as a congregation to contemplate that as we go through the season. And what's lovely about Advent is it is totally uncommercialized. We don't have Advent sales. We don't have Advent cocktail parties. It's just kind of pure. And it allows the people of God to enjoy the gifts and the physicalness of the season. We simply have the animals huddling together in the snow, waiting for Jesus to appear any day now, braying hot breath into the crisp air while angel snowplows prepare the way of the Lord. And the harvest is gathered in on Thursday. We had this wonderful Advent, or we had a kind of harvest service, Thanksgiving service. But Advent is a kind of harvest of our lives, It helps us to reflect what it is we are doing, what it is we're gathering into our lives that is completed, and kind of reflecting on our own legacies and what it is that we have enjoyed about this journey and what we are enjoying about this journey and how we share this with the little ones. And that is about this season. So I'm going to end with a very simple prayer that I believe connects the theme of Advent and preparing and future. and it's from a little book called Celtic Daily Prayer. And I invite you just to look at the candle, to look at the Advent light as I read it. O God, I cannot undo the past, or make it never have happened. Neither can you. There are some things that are not possible even for you, but not many. I ask you humbly and from the bottom of my heart, please God, would you write straight with my crooked lines? Out of the serious mistakes of my life, will you make something beautiful for you? Teach me to live at peace with you, to make peace with others and even with myself. Give me fresh vision. Let me experience your love so deeply that I am free to face the future with a steady eye, forgiven and strong in hope. Amen.